Well, boys and girls, I did it again. I went to record an episode on Streamyard, and I had all of my settings exactly the way that I wanted them, and it sounded really great in my headphones the entire time. Everything was coming through my microphone. And then when I went to process the episode, I realized that for whatever reason, Streamyard had defaulted to my computer mic and not the actual microphone that I have that makes my voice sound really good, and my episodes sound like they are being professionally done. So this episode's not going to sound that great. It's very frustrating, but obviously I cannot go back and re-record the entire episode. So I apologize for the way that this episode is going to sound today. I hope that it doesn't distract you too much from the ideas that are in this episode, because I was on fire, I thought, today. I really enjoyed this one. But again, my computer, my setup, all very frustrating, just defaulted. And I guess I'm just going to have to double check and triple check every time that I do something like this to make sure it doesn't kick me back to my computer microphone. So sorry about that. I just wanted to let you know ahead of time that the episode is going to sound a little bit thinner than usual. I'm playing around with it a little bit in post-production, so we'll see what happens with that. But don't let it detract you from the rest of the episode, which is really great. Again, thank you guys for listening, and I apologize for the lower than average sound quality on this episode. This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. It is President's Day morning. I am doing another live video recording of a solo episode where I did a little bit of research, and I've said in the past that I generally like to do these audio only so that I can go back and edit some of my rants and the rabbit trails that I go on. But we want more video content at LCI, so here I am. I'm going to do this. I got my first cup of coffee. It's going to be great. So basically, what's going on for those of you guys that are in the listening to this only on audio, and I guess for you guys that are on YouTube too, you deserve to understand why I'm doing this morning. I had another interview fall through, which happens from time to time, unfortunately, and I was kind of working on a tight schedule, and so I had to come up with some content to get out there for you guys. And so I'm actually recording this on President's Day morning. We are off school today in honor of the president, and part of me really wanted to do an episode where I just tore down all of the mythologies surrounding the presidents that have been alive during my lifetime, because they've all, in my opinion, as a libertarian, been pretty terrible and have done more to increase American imperialism than many of their predecessors, Woodrow Wilson and FDR notwithstanding. And then you can throw Abraham Lincoln in there as well. But, I did an episode a couple of years ago called The War Crimes of Bush and Obama that I'll put a link to in the show notes. It was one of my most popular episodes of all time. And you can check that out if you want to get my thoughts on why I feel like the presidents aren't really doing what they were constitutionally designed to do. And this will dovetail a little bit into what I'm talking about today. So, but the good thing is, it's nice and early on President's Day morning. I got up, did my workout like I always do on a Monday morning. Got a little breakfast, and so I'm ready to go. The caffeine's starting to hit me. I'm starting to feel good, so I'm excited about doing this episode with you guys today. So essentially what's going on, and what I really wanted to talk to you about, and why it is kind of related to President's Day in a way, is that I'm working on this book, as I said a couple of weeks ago, and I'm about 3 chapters in, but I more or less have the entire thing already outlined. I know what direction I want to take this book in, and now it's just a matter of doing my research and trying to get this thing written. And so it's been really interesting because I do a lot of author interviews for the show, which requires me to do a lot of reading. And I really enjoy doing that. And I don't plan on stopping. But over the next 6 or 7 months, as I really get the core of this book written, I'm probably going to do fewer author interviews, just because, especially with some of these bigger books, like from Eerdmans, I did The Next Quest, which gave me a lot of interviews, but I've done a lot of books that are just kind of bigger, and I'm just trying to balance all of my time with that. I got a full-time job and a family, and I'm also trying to write a book and do, a regular podcast. So there's a lot to balance here. And one of the things that I am really thankful for as it relates to this book that I'm writing is the book is more or less about redefining basic economic and political concepts and just demonstrating how New Testament scholarship has not done a very good job of articulating a clear, consistent definition of a lot of these economic terms. And I think that this leads to biblical scholars importing a lot of modern economic ideas into the Bible and misreading the Bible as a result of that. And then also when they draw conclusions about how we should apply these passages in the modern world, they wind up making mistakes because they simply don't think about these issues philosophically, and they don't really understand these concepts. And I've done a lot of work on the show already regarding the definitions of capitalism and socialism. It's something I'm very passionate about, and something that I believe that everyone needs to seriously reconsider, because when I read my basic economics textbook in 2016 for the first time, I was like 27 years old at this point. I had never read a book on economics. It was life-changing to me because I realized for the first time that capitalism had nothing to do with like being mean to poor people or being greedy, and that was just the way that people had used that term for my entire life. And that wasn't the right way that term should have been defined. So big game changer for me. And I've done a lot of work and will continue to do a lot of work dealing with the interface between capitalism and socialism and things like that. And of course, what we're talking about on the show today is kind of related to that as well. But I wanted to deal with one of the other main themes in the book that I'm working through right now. And I'm almost done with this chapter, where we need to redefine how we understand basic political concepts. And this is one of the points that I make to a lot of people, especially, and these are especially people that don't have any sort of, familiarity with political theory, and that tend to accept the narrative about the nature of the American government that's portrayed by the media and the politicians themselves, and that's reinforced by our public school system and just kind of the way that people popularly conceptualize American governance. When people think about how the political process works in the United States, and when people think about fundamental, like, political terms, they generally think that there are two teams or two parties. You have the left wing and you have the right wing. And it used to be that people on the left wing were called liberals and people on the right wing were called conservatives. And for reasons that I don't care for very much, I don't think that describing the left as liberal is helpful anymore. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm a libertarian and I come out of the classical liberal tradition, which is all about free markets and free speech and limited government and things like that. And that doesn't really define the policy platform of the Democratic Party. And I really do believe that the average person on the left in the United States today is more accurately described as a progressive, somebody that believes that the government can progressively, that when government power is utilized effectively and reasonably and rationally, that this can bring about great progress in our society. And so you have this dynamic in American political life where there are two teams. You have the conservative right and the progressive left, and they are portrayed as being diametrically opposed to one another, that there's no common ground, there's almost no middle ground between the left and the right. And all you have to do is turn on your TV or open up Google News or whatever it is, and you'll see that almost all of the articles that are about these debates between these two different political camps cast them as being, eternally opposed. It's a dichotomy. There's a gulf between progressivism and conservatism, and that gap can't be bridged. And I just think that is fundamentally wrong. And in a lot of ways, I actually think that conservatives and progressives have a lot more in common with each other than they do with us libertarians. And I really do believe that the majority of the differences between the progressives and the conservatives have to do with kind of the secondary consequences of their policies, but the fundamental structure of progressivism and conservatism, the presupposition of both of those political philosophies are fundamentally the same. And I will talk to people about the legacy of like George Bush and Barack Obama. You have not George H.W. Bush, although he would definitely fall into this category as well. You have George W. Bush and you have Barack Obama. And even though there is in the popular conception of these two presidencies, this big difference between the two of them in terms of style and tone and just their approach to the public and everything like that. And it's often seemed like, Barack Obama was this progressive, and if you're on the right, you think that this is terrible, but if you're on the left, you think that he's a hero who really fought for those that were in need. And then, conservative people on the right will say, George W. Bush was just trying to bring about conservatism, and we got attacked on 9/11, and we had to go and fight all these wars, and that kind of took away from his ability to manage the domestic economy in a way that a conservative would, but we still have to support George W. Bush. And my contention is that, if you look at the actual policies that were implemented by these two presidents, we more or less had 16 years of the exact same administration. There's very little daylight between the actual policies that were implemented by both of these presidents. And that is just amazing to me, considering how they are almost universally understood to be dramatically different from one another. It's just not true. So when I say that I believe that the American left and right, that progressives and conservatives have more in common with each other than they do differences, it'd be easy for someone that doesn't think about politics philosophically to come back and say, well, you're just absolutely wrong. And again, when it comes to what we see in the media, the way that the left and the right kind of manifest their political philosophies, yeah, there are absolutely giant differences. And I think even with the new Trump administration, there are some very real policy differences, like some substantial policy differences between the second Trump term and what has come before him. And that's absolutely true. And a lot of people will also point to the culture war issues where there is a huge divide between the left and the right. And that's absolutely correct. Like, we have to understand that if you are a progressive Democrat, your worldview in terms of the culture war is going to be way different than if you are a conservative Republican. Like, those views of the culture war are extremely different. So why then am I saying that progressives and conservatives have more in common with each other than they are dissimilar? And the reason for that is that at the heart of both progressivism and conservatism is the idea that we need to have some sort of governmental structure that can, in at least some cases, use force against peaceful people in order to accomplish its goals. That's the real similarity between progressivism and conservatism. Now, progressives have always been and it's built into the name progressive. They've always been very self-conscious about the use of government force. They've always been very self-conscious about the use of political force to say that they're trying to build a progressively better society. So liberty is kind of a threat to that. And in reality, for the progressive, they believe that if you give power over to these benevolent technocrats, then they'll be able to plan our society out for us and make it progressively better. Now, conservatives, and this is just to be completely fair, conservatives don't want, by and large, at least conservative voters don't want, by and large, the same amount of government interference in the economy and in the private lives of individuals as progressives do. However, conservatives still believe that there is a role for the state, and that role that the state plays will sometimes necessarily justify the use of force against completely innocent people. So even though progressives want a much, at least theoretically, and we're talking about voters here, because I don't think the politicians are actually that much different. I think that progressive and conservative politicians are both responsible for growing the size of government in the United States and for war and imperialism. Like, they're pretty much all, the politicians are all on the same team, which is related to something that we're going to talk about in a couple weeks, right? So these politicians, they have the exact same policy preferences, but for the average conservative voter and for the average progressive voter, they both believe that there is a role for the state in managing the private lives of innocent people. And to be totally fair, the conservatives generally want less of that than the progressives. They believe that there's a more limited role for the government to play in managing the economy and managing individual freedoms and things like that, whereas progressives want a much heavier role because they believe in kind of technocracy, where if you put these brilliant people in power, that they can just help bring us to this glorious, kind of utopian end in the future. And I think that both of them are based on the exact same philosophy. They're both based on the philosophy that government does have to be involved, and that sometimes force against innocent people is completely justified. And this is where libertarianism stands in stark contrast to both progressivism and conservatism. And I'm actually going to argue over the next 20 minutes or so that the real political spectrum in the modern Western world today is not between progressivism and conservatism. It's between libertarianism and authoritarianism. And so I argue that progressives and conservatives both believe in varying degrees of authoritarianism. Conservatives, usually, at least conservative voters, much less so than the progressives, but they both still believe that there is a role in society for arbitrary authority, that we need arbitrary authority in order to have a peaceful society. And that is markedly different than the libertarian conception of society, where all of these social programs and things that are theoretically provided by force, using force by the government, could be provided through voluntary means. And one of the reasons why I think people misunderstand this is that a lot of people, when they, and including a lot of libertarians, when they think about what libertarianism means, they generally think about libertarianism as a philosophy that attempts to maximize freedom. And to a certain extent, that is true. But I think that as I've done more research, as I've thought about the real fundamental principles of libertarian philosophy, I think that libertarianism is much more about trying to limit aggression against peaceful people than it is about maximizing freedom. Now, if you limit aggression against peaceful people, if you say, no, we actually don't believe that there are institutions in society that have or that should have arbitrary power over individuals, then you're going to get a maximal amount of freedom. But libertarians are very much concerned about respecting the rights of all individuals. And I'm going to do a little bit of reading here because I think it's really important. So I got Murray Rothbard's For a New Liberty. I think it was written in 1973, but it's an excellent, it's called the Libertarian Manifesto. And this is just a phenomenal introduction to some of the fundamental principles of libertarianism and how they could be applied to various public policy problems. Highly recommend this if you haven't read it. And it's a great introduction to Murray Rothbard, very readable. And Murray Rothbard's always very fun to read. But he lays out at the beginning of his book what he calls the non-aggression principle, or the non-aggression axiom in this book, but it's generally referred to as the NAP, the non-aggression principle by libertarians. And this is the fundamental, the most fundamental, the most basic concept within libertarian philosophy. There is no more fundamental principle than this. And I just think that it's so beautiful and morally consistent. And I think that it's completely in line with the values that arise out of my Christian faith. So I want to explain this non-aggression axiom from the words of Murray Rothbard right here. And then we're going to talk about why this is very different than the authoritarianism offered by the supposed American left and right, the progressives and the conservatives, who actually share the same set of presuppositions about the need for arbitrary government power. Murray Rothbard says this: the libertarian creed rests upon one central axiom, that no man or group of men may aggress against the person or property of anyone else. This may be called the non-aggression axiom, generally referred to by libertarians as the non-aggression principle, the NAP, the NAP. Aggression is defined as the initiation of the use or threat of physical violence against the person or property of anyone else. Aggression is therefore synonymous with invasion. So the fundamental idea here is that every single human being owns their own body and they own their own property, and no one has a right to aggress against them. No one has the right to initiate aggression against another person. And he's going to go on to talk about the way that this relates to law. And I think that this is really, really important. And it's based on like a Lockean conception of the role of government, which I think is heavily indebted to fundamental Christian values. He says this, Murray Rothbard does: if no man may aggress against another, if, in short, everyone has the absolute right to be free from aggression, then this at once implies that the libertarian stands foursquare for what are generally known as civil liberties: the freedom to speak, publish, assemble, and to engage in such victimless crimes as pornography, sexual deviation, and prostitution, which the libertarian does not regard as crimes at all, since he defines a crime as a violent invasion of someone else's person or property. Furthermore, he regards conscription as slavery on a massive scale. We do. And since war, especially modern war, entails the mass slaughter of civilians, the libertarian regards such conflicts as mass murder and therefore totally illegitimate. So again, this is the fundamental principle of libertarian. It's not libertarianism. It's not about the maximization of human freedom. It's about the restraint of arbitrary power so that individuals with their rights are not aggressed against by some institution that has a monopoly on power in society. And this is where there is a giant gap between the libertarian worldview, which is based on non-aggression and the respect of rights, especially property rights, your body being the primary piece of property that you own, and conservatives and progressives that both believe that there are certain situations in which those rights have to be violated, that there should, in fact, be institutions in society that are given the ability to use aggression against peaceful people, especially if it will bring about a preferred set of social or political ends, which is really the idea of progressivism. It's these progressives begin with this kind of utopian vision of society and think, oh, how are we going to be able to get there? And the only way that we can get there is if we grab the reins of power. Whereas the conservatives, like, they might be thinking, well, we have to restrain some of these progressive impulses, but we also have to grab the reins of power and wield it against peaceful people if we are going to restrain these progressive ideas. They both begin with this kind of vision of the way that the world ought to be, and then they selectively use government power and government violence to help us achieve those goals. Whereas the libertarian begins with the philosophical principle of non-aggression and works from there. So progressivism and conservatism are much more concerned about like the process of government, whereas libertarianism is much more focused on these fundamental moral principles. And as Murray Rothbard is going to go on to say, and he says this several times in For a New Liberty, he says that libertarianism is essentially just the application of universal moral laws to every sphere of life. So if it's wrong for me to kill or steal from my neighbor, then just because someone happens to be born into a monarchy or win an election, this does not give them a right to kill or steal from other people. We need to be applying these laws of morality to all people. Government doesn't get a special position. They don't get a special privilege here. Now, there's another book I'm going to read from real quick. This one is not shown on the screen here. Oh, there we go. Okay. A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism by Hans-Herman Hoppe. I really enjoy this book. Hoppe was an associate of Murray Rothbard. He's kind of controversial in some quarters for making the bold and audacious claim that it's okay to be a white person. Like, you don't have to hate yourself just because you happen to be born white. And he also makes another bold and audacious claim that actually Western civilization has contributed positively to the development of the human species. Both of these things are not controversial in my opinion, but for left-wingers, these are the kinds of statements that cause them to lose their mind. But I agree with Hoppe on this. Like, I think it's okay to be white. Doesn't make you a bad guy. You can't choose what color you happen to be born into. The only thing that you can choose are the choices that you make after you're born. And, Western civilization has contributed a lot of really great things, especially technologically, to human civilization. And we would be much worse off as a species had Western civilization not done that. So I think Hoppe gets a lot more crap than he actually deserves because he's bold and brash. But, we need people that are bold and brash. I like that, So here's what he's going to say. So in this book, obviously, it's called A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. And if you're really interested in trying to understand how these two terms work and kind of the philosophy behind socialism and capitalism as I've articulated it on the show, this book is absolutely worth it. It's a little bit more philosophical. It's a little bit denser than For a New Liberty, but it's well worth the read. And I want to read just a little section of it here. And one of the things, I'm actually going to read the introduction to this section that I want to read that has to do with political power and non-aggression, because I think that he does a really good job of outlining how important it is to define these terms and concepts. I'm saying that, the majority of Americans don't have a strong conceptual basis for the way that they understand politics and political power. And if we really want to have a concrete definition or a concrete understanding of these concepts, then we have to be very careful about how we define these terms. So here's what he's going to say. It says, before advancing to the more exciting field of analyzing diverse policy schemes from the standpoint of economic theory and political philosophy, it is essential to introduce and explain the basic concepts used throughout the following study. And this is relating to what we're talking about on the show today. Indeed, the concepts explained in this chapter, the concepts of property, contract, aggression, capitalism, and socialism, are so basic, so fundamental, that one cannot even avoid making use of them, if at times only implicitly. Unfortunately, though, the very fact that in analyzing any kind of human activity and or any kind of interpersonal relationship, one must make use of these concepts does not imply that everyone has a precise understanding of them. It seems instead to be the other way around. Because the concept of property, for instance, is so basic that everyone seems to have some immediate understanding of it, most people never think about it carefully and can, as a consequence, produce at best a very vague definition. So he's going to go on to articulate the definition of these terms that he's going to be using throughout this chapter, which is what exactly we're trying to do here today by reframing the political spectrum between liberty and authority instead of this kind of fake left and right, these fake left and right differences where they actually agree structurally on the way that power ought to be mediated against innocent people, at least in certain cases. So he says, but starting from an imprecisely stated or assumed definitions and building a complex network of thought upon them can lead only to intellectual disaster. Absolutely. And in this book that I'm writing, this is exactly what I'm arguing about biblical scholarship in general, that they're using all of these terms imprecisely, and it's leading to a lot of mistakes in this field when it comes to the conceptual application of a lot of these modern social and political concepts. For the original imprecision and loopholes will then pervade and distort everything derived from them. To avoid this, the concept of property must first be clearly characterized. And here's where Hoppe is going to give his He's going to give his definition of these terms and relate them back to non-aggression. So he says, next to the concept of action, property is the most basic category in the social sciences. As a matter of fact, all other concepts to be introduced in this chapter, aggression, contract, capitalism, and socialism, are definable in terms of property. Aggression being aggression against property, contract being a non-aggressive relationship between property owners, socialism being an institutionalized policy of aggression against property, and capitalism being an institutionalized policy of the recognition of property and contractualism. So you can see that Hans-Herman Hoppe is going to reduce all of these concepts to aggression against property. And for Hans-Herman Hoppe, and you got to read the book, property isn't just what you happen to own, although he says that the only legitimate way of owning something is either by original appropriation or by contractual exchange. In other words, you only own something if you've come about it without using violence or coercion against somebody else. There is no other moral justification for ownership. And then he even reduces that further, going back to this idea that all human beings have been given their body, and that even in a world of super abundant resources where we don't have to worry about the scarcity of any other natural resources, our body and our bodies and our time would still be scarce. So we still have to have rules governing how the property of your body and the property of your time ought to be managed. And essentially that he says that since your body is yours and self-ownership starts with your body, no one has a right to aggress against that. And if you've utilized your time to originally appropriate a good or a service or to acquire it contractually, morally, then no one has a right to aggress against you or take that away from you. And this is so fundamental to libertarianism, that every single human being owns themselves. Within libertarianism, capitalism is simply the system of private property ownership where people exchange and appropriate goods in a moral way, respecting the natural rights of all other actors and refusing to initiate aggression against other people. And all of this goes back to that idea that there is a non-aggression principle in libertarianism, and that we have to hold that up as our moral North Star when we think about these complex political issues. And so when it comes to the non-aggression principle, conservatives and progressives both wholeheartedly reject this idea because they share the exact same assumptions, and that is that there are, at least in certain situations, times when political authorities should arbitrarily aggress against innocent people, whether it's to bring about this glorious end that they see, to achieve some sort of social program, to try to create equality or wealth redistribution, or whatever it is. Conservatives and progressives both believe in the power of authoritarianism, the power of arbitrary authority, at least in some cases. And libertarians, at least libertarians that are philosophically consistent, reject that as a philosophical option, that we should not be aggressing against peaceful and innocent people in any circumstances, regardless of the kind of utopian vision of the future that you might have. And this is a good time for a coffee break here. I'm very sorry for the people listening to this on the RSS feeds. See, these are the kind of things that if I was doing this solo and doing this without video, I would just cut out, but I'm not going to. So you guys can enjoy hearing me drink coffee in the background. All right. So this is the whole point of the episode today, is that I really do believe, as I've said, that the real divide in American politics is between libertarianism, liberty, and authoritarianism, authority, and that we need to reconceptualize the way that we understand politics through those two lenses. Now, there are plenty of conservatives who reject libertarianism on those grounds. They'll say, all right, the problem with libertarianism is that when push comes to shove, or when it's time to get something done, they don't have the philosophical freedom to use aggression if it's necessary to bring about a greater social good, that libertarianism can't get the job done when the job really needs to get done. That's the conservative case against libertarianism, and I understand where they're coming from. What I want to acknowledge here, though, is that the conservatives have to realize that by doing that, they are embracing a form of authoritarianism that is by degree different than the way that progressives assume authoritarian power, but structurally in principle, it's no different than the way that progressives appropriate political power. And so you can say, yeah, libertarianism just doesn't work. And there does have to be some sort of, there does have to be times when authorities are given arbitrary political power and they can exercise that over other people for the greater good. And that's fine. But you have to realize that you're an authoritarian if you believe that is an extension of authoritarian thinking. And that's dramatically different than the libertarian conception of non-aggression and the respect of property rights towards all people that I've been outlining on this show, which is why, again, the real political spectrum in the Western world is between liberty and authority, between libertarianism and authoritarianism. And if I can, and I'm going to beat this drum probably for the rest of my life, if you are a progressive, or you're probably not a progressive if you're listening to this show, but I hope you are. If you are, that's great. And I would love to talk to you. Send me an email or DM me or whatever, and we can have this conversation. It'd be awesome. But if you are a progressive or a conservative, you have to realize that you are willing to use arbitrary force against peaceful people to achieve your subjective preferred social, political, and economic ends. And so that's the reason why philosophically progressivism and conservatism are structurally the same. And the thing that's so frustrating to me about progressives that conservatives really aren't guilty of as much, because conservatives are open about the fact that they want to wield power to make society a better place. Like, conservatives aren't going to lie. Generally, conservatives don't lie about that. Like, when conservatives believe that they're implementing a certain political policy that's for our own good, they'll say, look, we're using power to make this happen, but we believe this is the only way to get it done. Whereas progressives and a Christian, especially Christian progressive Christians are very guilty of this. They will want to wield massive amounts of authoritarian power, and they want to silence speech and suppress individual liberties, and they want to expand the size and scope of government, and they want to make economic decisions for every single business in the United States. But they couch this in the language of justice and peace and love and compassion, and they do all of that to mask the fact that they're being massive authoritarians and not respecting the private property rights of other individuals. That, in fact, when the progressives talk about peace and love and justice and kindness and compassion, what they're really doing is just giving themselves a moral excuse for their authoritarian violence against innocent people, which is all that progressivism always has been and always forever will be. And the thing that I just wish that the progressives, and especially the progressive Christians, would acknowledge is that when they want their favorite technocrats or their favorite politicians to regulate every aspect of society using the power of the law, using the power of the state, that they're being massive authoritarians, and they're willing to use violence to implement their preferred social and economic ends. Now, we can have a conversation about whether or not progressive policies would make the world a better place. That's fine. We can also have a conversation about whether or not conservative policies would make the world a better place. And that's also great too. But we have to acknowledge that both progressives and conservatives are willing to use authoritarian violence against innocent people, and libertarians that are philosophically consistent and that believe in the non-aggression principle are simply not. That is not morally permissible for libertarians. And so we absolutely outright have to reject all forms of authoritarian power. And once you understand that dynamic, then we can completely deconstruct this artificial distinction between the left and the right in American politics, when in reality, the left and the right is all about violence, coercion, and authoritarianism. Libertarianism is all about peace and non-aggression and foregoing the use of violence. Okay. And we even saw this like in when Murray Rothbard talked about the legal consequences of this. The reason why libertarians like me don't think that prostitution and drug use is a crime is not that I think that prostitution and drug use is moral. I don't believe, I guess there are some drugs that I think are pretty moral. I'm pretty sure that marijuana is actually a lot better in terms of health outcomes for most people than a lot of the hard pharmaceutical drugs that are being pushed by these companies that make billions of dollars a year and are heavily subsidized by the taxpayers and have invested billions of dollars in lobbying. But that's a story for another day. But just because I, as a libertarian, believe that prostitution, that's a great example. Just because as a libertarian I believe that prostitution is immoral doesn't mean that I believe that it's illegal. If there is a woman who has the fundamental right to self-ownership over her body, and she wants to contractually exchange sexual favors with a man, or I guess another woman too, I don't know. I don't know really anything about prostitution other than it's sex for payment. But if she wants to contractually sell her body to somebody else, and it's all done contractually and both parties agree and consent to the behavior, then they have every right to do that. And you shouldn't take this woman and throw her in a cage for doing nothing that actually violates the natural rights of somebody else. She hasn't done anything to harm anyone in the classical sense of the term. Now, again, I think that this does great moral damage and spiritual damage and things like that, but she's not guilty of committing a crime. And it's the same thing with drug use. It's the same thing with pornography. It's the same thing with all of these. They're all immoral, in my opinion. And as Christians, we should be fighting against them, and we should be trying to convince people that they shouldn't do them. But we shouldn't use the power of the state to round them up and throw them in a cage if they've not actually violated the natural rights of another individual. They haven't done anything to aggress against anybody else. Therefore, in the technical sense of the term, what they're doing cannot be criminal activity, because libertarians believe that the only real crimes are crimes against property. You know, when you violate somebody else's natural rights, that's a crime. But if you're using your own body that you own, then the way that you utilize that body, and especially if you're engaged in contractual exchanges, it can never be a crime. And people confuse libertarianism with this, oh, you just want people to be able to go out there and use drugs, and you want to legalize prostitution, and you want all of this degeneracy in society. No, we don't. We actually want to be able to fight against that. We just don't believe that it's right to throw people in a cage for making decisions that we deem morally insufficient, which is a huge difference between libertarianism and progressivism and conservatism. Since progressivism and conservatism are both authoritarian, they're willing to use state violence to throw people in cages or even kill them if they engage in moral activity that they deem to be unfavorable. And that's just the way that it goes. That's just a truth. Now, one of the goals that I have with this book, I'm going to be spending a lot of time going through it. In fact, the way that the book is shaping up right now is like the first probably third of the book is all going to be like methodology and definition. So I'm going to define capitalism and socialism. I'm going to redefine the political spectrum as I've been talking about it today. And then I'm going to talk about, like biblical interpretation, how we interpret the Bible historically, what kind of information we can reliably expect to get from our interpretations of the Bible. And then I'm going to have a section that talks about kind of ancient conceptions of economics and politics in the Greco-Roman world, and then in Judea and Galilee in particular. So that's going to be like the first third of my book. And then the last 2/3 are all going to be biblical interpretation. I'm going to go through all these passages in the Bible, kind of try to work through how they ought to be understood historically, and how biblical scholars have like snuck their own modern imprecise conceptions of economics and politics back into these texts. But as I was preparing for the episode today, I just thought that there were some really great examples in the Bible of kind of what I'm talking about here. And the argument that I've made is that there's not a biblical case for libertarianism, because libertarianism is a philosophy that only arose in the wake of the Enlightenment. So libertarianism as a philosophy is designed to answer modern problems and address modern questions that just weren't being asked in the ancient world. And it's the same thing with both socialism and capitalism. We have to take it for granted that ancients didn't think about economics in the same way that we did today. And so it's very anachronistic and ahistorical to take these concepts and assume that the writers of the Bible would have a perspective on them. So I don't like it when libertarians say that there is a libertarian reading of Scripture, because there's not. But I do think that what the Bible gives us is fundamental moral principles. And as Christians, we have to see which of these modern ideas more closely align with the principles that are outlined in the Bible. And I also think, and this is kind of what Tom Holland does in his book, Dominion, and then there's another guy, I want to get his name right. I can never, I think his name is Nick Spencer, who wrote another book. He's an English guy called The Evolution of the West that talks about this dynamic as well. I think Richard Spencer is the KKK racist guy. I don't want to, but maybe, I don't know. Whatever. I think it's Nick Spencer and Tom Holland both written great books about how kind of the foundational ideology of the Western world is built on Christian presuppositions. And Tom Holland's book is great because he starts off talking about how in the ancient world they're willing to crucify people, and now we don't do that. Well, what change took place morally? And he says it's Christianity. So obviously, many of these ideas in the modern world have been shaped by certain aspects of Christian thought, and there's been a lot of Christian hypocrisy throughout the ages. So, but essentially, it's a story for another day too. But essentially what I want to do right now is just take a look at a couple of passages and think, okay, if we're reading these passages, do they fundamentally, kind of presuppositionally as a matter of principle, line up more with libertarianism as a respect for the rights of other people and as a commitment to non-aggression? Or are they compatible with authoritarian approaches to government, the ones that are offered by the progressives and the conservatives? What principles are outlined in the Bible, and how do we apply them in the modern world? And one of the first passages that I want to go to is one of my favorites, because I think it's very challenging. I think that Christians need to actually hear the words that Jesus is saying here. So this is from Mark chapter 10. This is verses 35 to 45. And here's what Jesus says, or here's what Mark says about this exchange that Jesus has with two of his disciples. He says, James and John, the two sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" They said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup which I drink you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or my left, this is not mine to give, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant and with James and John. Calling them to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you, but whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." So this is what Jesus says. Now, obviously, in the Gospels, Son of Man is a reference to Daniel chapter 7. This is the figure within the kind of the apocalyptic presentation of God's throne room, who helps God bring about his kingdom on earth and who rescues the people of God. So the Son of Man has this very important identity within the world of Daniel, and the writers of the Gospels apply this title, Son of Man, to Jesus to evoke the fact that he is the one who's bringing about the kingdom and rescuing God's people. But notice what Jesus says at the very end of this, that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then he also says, and this is something that I want all my progressive and conservative listeners to hear. This is in verse 42. "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not to be this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man does this." So let me ask you this. We have this fundamental principle in the Bible where Jesus is willing, as the Son of Man, to make sacrifices for us. And we get no hint in the Gospels whatsoever that Jesus ever wants to use the authoritarian power of government to force people to comply with his kingdom agenda. And in fact, Jesus' entire prophetic ministry, as he went around proclaiming the kingdom of God, that the reign of God was at hand, and healing people and performing signs that revealed that he was actually the prophet that was bringing about the kingdom of God, there's no sense in Jesus' ministry at all that he wants the political authorities to enforce this by law. He's not using the power of the state to bring about his kingdom utopia. Instead, he's offering his life as a ransom for many, not only to vindicate us, not only to take care of our sins and the sins of Israel, to rescue, to liberate the world from its enslavement to sin, but to set an example for his disciples to follow. So Jesus's kingdom is built on the idea of non-aggression, of non-violence. And in fact, it's not just non-aggression, but the willingness to take aggression upon yourself for the sake of other people. It's beautiful. It's such a beautiful idea that our Messiah, that our Savior, that the King of the entire world, who inaugurated God's kingdom, who was raised from the dead and now sits at the right hand of the Father, was willing to suffer and die for our sake instead of appropriating political power for his own. So this leaves us with this dynamic then. If you're trying to take this principle that our King, our Son of Man, was willing to sacrifice and die on behalf of other people instead of lording it over them like the rulers of the Gentiles do, then is this principle more consistent with a libertarian conception of non-aggression, or is it more consistent with the conservative and progressive conception of authoritarian government? And again, if you're a political progressive, and this is the way that they gloss this problem all the time, they'll say, well, we need a giant government and a giant IRS with the power to tax and to basically put a gun to people's head and force them to pay up, because if we don't, we won't have all of these social programs to help the poor people. So actually, when we're using the power of government, we're doing it to help people. We're doing it to be compassionate. But I think that the principle that arises out of this is that if you really want to help poor people, you should just do it yourself. Like, you should just go out there and get the job done yourself, because initiating aggression against somebody who doesn't share your worldview, I think, is morally off limits based upon what Jesus says here. If the principle is that the greatest among us will be servants and not try to be rulers, not try to be authoritarians, then we have to take that principle as our starting point. And I think that this means that the modern conception of both progressivism and conservatism is opposed to the principles that arise out of Jesus's teaching. You know, you also have this really, really interesting passage here, and let me I get this. I'm looking at my notes on the screen here, which is why I'm staring directly at the screen here. Where in John, it's one of my favorite quotes in John, where he says that greater love. This is Jesus, and this is the Last Supper discourse. The one that runs through several chapters towards the end of John, where Jesus says, "Just as my Father has loved me, I have also loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you, so that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that one lay down his life for his friends." So again, Jesus isn't saying there's no greater love than using the authoritarian power of the state to achieve supposedly Christian social ends. It's really just a subjective interpretation of somebody's Christian values being imposed upon the rest of society by force. Jesus is saying there's no greater love than laying your life down for your friend, not using aggression against other people, but being willing to take aggression on for the sake of others. It's a very powerful passage. And again, we have to think about what principle Jesus is outlining here. Is this principle of laying down your life for other people more consistent, if we have to translate this into these modern political debates, is this more consistent with progressivism or conservatism, or is this more consistent with libertarianism? And I know that there have been thousands of theologians throughout the ages that have tried to, come up with this two kingdoms conception or whatever, but I don't see it. And this is one of the reasons why I'm a libertarian. Like, I believe that Jesus gave us this commandment, and that this commandment is universally applicable, and that just because you happen to win an election or be in government, it doesn't mean that you are morally absolved from having to follow this principle. It doesn't. It doesn't. And so if you want to take care of someone, or if you want to see the kingdom of God being built, you can't do it through the authoritarian power of the government. You can only do it through self-sacrificing for other people. This is very consistent with what Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. We've gone over that one. That's the Christ hymn. It's very, very famous passage where twice in this Christ hymn, Paul says, have this attitude in yourselves that was also in Christ Jesus, and then says, Jesus was in the form of God, but did not consider equality with God something to be grasped or held onto, but rather was made in the likeness of man. So it talks about, I think it talks about Jesus's incarnation, and then it talks about how Jesus was willing to submit to death on a cross. He humbled himself, becoming obedient even to death on a cross. And it's for that reason that God highly exalted him, and that Jesus was ascended to the right hand of the Father, not because he wielded authoritarian political power, but because he was willing to sacrifice himself twice by becoming made in the image of man, and then also by taking on the form of man, even though he's in the form of God, being made in the likeness of human beings, and then also sacrificing himself for death on a cross. The conservatives and the progressives have no political analogy to that, because their entire political worldview is based on violence against peaceful people. Another great example of this is from 1 John 4, where John says, and this is another one of my favorite passages, "In this is love, not that we love God, but that he loved us and sent his son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another." So in this passage, you have the idea that God takes the initiative to act against people even when people reject God, and that Jesus sacrificed himself so that our sins could be taken care of, for our atonement, for the propitiation of our sins. And this is this beautiful image of what God is willing to do for us, even towards those that reject him. And so this is what's funny about the progressive mentality, is that for people like me that reject the welfare state because I think it's built on violence, and I think it's incredibly ineffective, and I think it creates a permanent underclass, progressive Christians would say, in the name of justice and compassion, that the tax man has to come to my house and put a gun to my head and tell me that I have to give to this charitable organization in order to be a truly loving person, that I have to give up my money against my will to these government officials who will then give it to people that they think are more deserving of it against my will. And the progressive Christians will say that that's love, that it's the loving thing to do is to tax people and use the power of the state to get money so that we can have all of these redistributive welfare programs. And that just, I think, completely cuts against the grain of what Jesus is saying here. And it's the same thing when conservatives, especially going back to the 1980s, when conservatives try to implement all of these culture war laws where they want to make it, impossible for people to make certain personal decisions. All of this is just morally wrong, and none of it's consistent with these basic principles that are outlined in Scripture. Again, if we are going to think about how we best apply these principles to our modern political, economic, and social context, I just don't see us being able to legitimize the use of aggression against peaceful people in any circumstances. It just doesn't make sense scripturally. I think there are a couple other good examples of this real quick on the flip side, and I'm going to do this very briefly and then wrap up today so that we can do this by the end of the hour mark. But if you look at a passage like Matthew chapter 23, which is Jesus's vicious condemnation of the Pharisees, he talks about he goes back to, and this is, a bit of Markan tradition that's picked up in Matthew, where he talks about the Pharisees and the scribes. And he says, Jesus spoke to the crowd. This is Matthew 23, 1 through 12. If you want to read the whole thing, I'm only read bits and pieces. But he says, the scribes and the Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore, all they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. They tie up heavy burdens and lay them on men's shoulders. They're unwilling to help them out. They do their deeds to be noticed by other people. They love places of honors. They love respectful greetings. They love being called rabbi. But then Jesus is going to say, do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father, he who is in heaven. Do not be called leaders, for one is your leader, that is Christ. But the greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. So you have to ask yourself, in a world where the political spectrum is defined by either libertarianism as a form of non-aggression and authoritarianism on the progressive left and the conservative right, the principle that arises out of this is the greatest among you shall be your servant, and whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, and whoever humbles himself shall be exalted. How does that principle correspond to authoritarianism on both the left and the right? I don't think it does. The problem with both conservatives and progressives, and especially conservative and progressive Christians, is that they want a degree of greatness. They want a degree of authority so that they can impose their values on society by force. And Jesus, I think, outright rejects that. His proclamation of the kingdom of God is a kingdom where people have to voluntarily accept to enter. And it's like what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, that wide is the path that leads to destruction and narrow is the gate that leads to life. We have to accept that people, maybe even most people, won't accept Jesus's teaching. There's no indication that we can use the power of the Gentiles, the power of the nations, the power of the state, the authoritarian power of the state to justify our violence against other people. Oh, here's another problem with this too. My mom's trying to call me right now. I have to call her back here in just a minute. I got to decline that call. There we go. I saw it on my computer. All right, sweet. So we have that there. And I really just want us to think about that. And I think that as a Christian, now, I'm not a pacifist. And you can listen to last week's episode with Cody Cook, where we talk about the difference between pacifism and nonviolence. But I do believe as a Christian, you have to be committed in principle to nonviolence, and especially the absolute rejection of the initiation of violence or force in any circumstance, regardless of whether or not you think that the initiation of that force will bring about a greater good. As Christians, we are not utilitarians. We don't believe that we can compromise, or we shouldn't believe that we can compromise on our Christian principles to bring about some greater good. And so the whole point of this conversation that we're having today is just to reconceptualize the way that we think about politics. I'm arguing that we have to understand the political spectrum in the West as a conflict between liberty and authority, and not as this kind of fake conflict between the left and the right, which is just really about which side gets to control the levers of power. And then as Christians, we should be extremely careful in the way that we apply our Christian principles to the modern world. And I think that ultimately this winds up with us embracing nonviolence. And the only political philosophy in the modern world that's philosophically committed to nonviolence in all cases against peaceful people is libertarianism. Therefore, libertarianism is the most consistent expression of our Christian values when it comes to modern political concepts. I really hope this episode helped you out today. This was a lot of fun there, guys. A couple of distractions in the last few seconds. My wife walked into the office here, too. I mean, it is her office, and so I got to respect the fact that I'm sharing this with her. And my mom tried to call me, so I guess I got to get out of here and get back with that. But I do hope that this episode was really helpful for you guys today, and that you guys learned a lot from this episode, and that it helped you maybe rethink about your social and political commitments. Again, as always, I'm really thankful that you guys take the time every week to listen to this show and to engage with these ideas that I think are so important. If it wasn't for the people that listen to this show, it would be completely not worth doing, just me screaming out there to the internet. But I know that there are those of you guys that are out there that are listening to this and getting something from it week in and week out. And I just really appreciate what you guys do. Again, I'm trying to build something up here. I had this joke on Twitter the other day where I was like, hey, you know, all you libertarians out there, you want to get public school teachers out of the school system. So help me get to 1 million followers so I can just live off the proceeds from my Twitter engagement. And I, you know, one day it would be pretty cool if I could do this full time and I wasn't a public school teacher. I think that would be pretty awesome. But I have a long, long way to go to get there. But there are a couple of ways that you can help me, especially if you're committed to abolishing the public school system. One of those ways is just following me over on Twitter. My handle is @ProLibertyPod. I post a lot of stuff over there, you know, try to get on there a couple times a day and post some comments. And I'm a pretty nice guy generally over on Twitter. I don't get into fights too often over there. It's not my thing, which might be one of the reasons why I don't have a ton of followers. So maybe that's, I got like 1,700 as of right now, but I could always use more. And then you can also go and follow me on the YouTube, which is @ProLibertyPod as well. I think the P, L, and P in that are capitalized, although I don't know if it makes a difference when you're searching on YouTube or not. I've been building out my YouTube channel over the last couple of months. Like I said, a lot of this stuff is going to be available on video over there. I do shorts every single day based on some of my episodes, just coming up with the main idea. So you can get like a 30-second clip of an idea that I found important from one of my interviews. And I do a little bit of exclusive video content over there. Hopefully, once I'm done with this book in a few months, I'll be able to do even a little bit more of that on YouTube. But go over there and follow me. I would love to get a bigger YouTube following there. I think YouTube's got a lot of potential, and so that's really cool too. And then, of course, go over to libertarianchristians.com and check us out. You can go to libertarianchristians.com/shop or /store, and you can pick up some sweet Protestant Libertarian Podcast merch. You can get some coasters, you can get some mugs, you can get some highball glasses. Those are my favorite. And hopefully in this year to come, we'll get more and more of our stuff out there so that you can buy it and represent the show. I'd love to get some t-shirts, some hoodies, some things like that in the future. I think that'd be sweet. So anyways, thank you guys so much for listening to this episode of today's show. And we will see you on Tuesday of next week, or maybe Thursday if it's a week where one of my What We Believe series is coming out. All right, you guys are awesome, and I'll see y'all later. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.